So just to cut to the chase, this is enormously important both for the countries that are concerned and for NATO. Relations with Russia have deteriorated very sharply since then. But it is, I just want to make the point that this, when the decisions were taken back in 2002, this was not in the teeth of Russian opposition. It was with the enthusiastic support of Vladimir Putin, who was offered an extremely good deal with NATO as part of the overall enlargement package. So once again, welcome to our excellent panelists. We have Ambassador Paul Jones, foreign ambassador to Warsaw for the United States, who's now a distinguished fellow at CEPA. We have General Landrum, who is now a senior fellow in our Transatlantic Defence and Security Programme, but used to be the Deputy Chair of the Military Committee. We have Mathieu Bouleg, Senior Fellow from our Transatlantic Defence and Security Programme, who's originally from France. And most important, we have a voice from the region, my very old friend Dalia Bankauskaite, former Lithuanian diplomat and now a Senior Fellow in our Democratic Resilience program. Welcome to you all. We're going to have a bit of a discussion for just a few minutes. Everyone's going to make a 1 or 2 minute intervention, and then we're going into the Q&A with our guests from the media. So I want to come to you first of all, Ambassador Jones, if you can unmute yourself. If you would like to give us a couple of pragmatic and expert perspective on the importance of Poland's membership of NATO, which of course happened before 2002, but having the Baltic states in NATO certainly changed the security perspective for Poland. So a couple of minutes from you, please, Ambassador.
Sure. Thank you so much, and delighted to be on this call and welcome everyone who's joining. I was U.S. Ambassador to Poland in 2015 to 18. And I can tell you in a word what NATO membership meant to Poland in a word was freedom. After its experience of being invaded by Hitler, then Stalin at the outbreak of World War II, which mirrored its being carved up for 123 years, obliterated from the map of Europe in the 19th century leading up to World War I. It obviously has very profound security concerns. But how NATO membership, I think, affected Poland and Poland's defense, and this would, different parts of this would also apply to some other countries in Central Eastern Europe, but it brought the United States sort of defense umbrella to Poland, and it did that in a way that was regional. So Poland obviously has a concept of its defense very much indivisible with its regional neighbors. Poland perceives if Russia were to invade or try to take a piece of territory of some of its neighbors, whether in the Baltics, in Ukraine, elsewhere, that Poland is very much next. So it brought, in the Polish view, U.S. and European defense in a regional perspective that eventually, with the inclusion of other allies, went from the Baltics down to Romania and Bulgaria, and it also made the commitment of its allied defense nonpartisan or bipartisan and consistent, not depending on the politics of whether the politics in Warsaw, the politics in European allies, or the politics in Washington. And that was very important. We saw during the recent government of Poland under Law and Justice, where there were some difficulties between on issues of democratic institutions between Washington, Brussels, Berlin, and Warsaw. But that really didn't affect the security commitments. And finally, I'd say it helped Poland and it helped other allies that joined integrate with Europe and the region, which helped them economically a great deal. So I'll pause there, but happy to go on how it may have changed since Russia's invasion.
Super. We'll look forward. There's an enormous amount to discuss here, both the past, present, and future. But I'm going to go straight over to Lance. From your perspective, what are your thoughts on the 20 years of the Big Bang expansion?
Yeah, thank you. I'm very happy to be here in this forum. I think with the addition of the central states and the eastern states in the NATO membership, their security clearly has been enhanced. Those members, right, they now have the blanket of Article 5, they have the blanket of NATO's deterrence and defense. And I think what we have seen, particularly with this surging malign influence and aggressive Russia since 2008, arguably, if you will, with Georgia and then following in 2014, infiltrations into Ukraine, that NATO has started to shift. And what we've seen in example is the enhanced force presence, right? These were the multinational battle groups that are in the Baltic states and also into Poland. And it's not just some forces, there's a multilateral aspect of it. There's a NATO flag over it, and there's an increased opportunity for these nations to interoperate and to act together as well. And I think the other thing to remember associated with this is that these nations are now under the sort of this umbrella of NATO. And if we recall, November and December of 2021 into January and February of 2022, that NATO's #1 goal was to be part of an international political effort in order to bolster diplomacy to prevent conflict in Ukraine. It's #1 goal, prevent the conflict. But NATO's goal right after that was to prevent the expansion of any conflict in Ukraine into the territory of NATO that would draw NATO into conflict. And in that sense, it has been successful. Now, we could argue whether or not Russia ever intended to cross into NATO territory, but regardless, it hasn't happened, and in foreseeable future, it doesn't seem to be happening. But NATO tried to be a player in that for things like the NATO-Russia Council. So these member states clearly have benefited from it. They continue to benefit from it. Now, it has evolved since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'm happy to go into that later if we'd like to transition.
Super. Thanks so much for that. And just for everyone's reference, I've put in the chat a PDF of the from the Rome summit, which includes the signatures of everyone at the end, including Putin's signature. So if you're interested in historical curiosities and going back to a completely different era, that's well worth a look. Let's go to you, Mathieu, because it was not so long ago that your President Emmanuel Macron, for whom, of course, you don't bear personal responsibility, referred to NATO as brain dead. Now France is absolutely leading the charge on reviving the European pillar of NATO. It's always been a degree of ambiguity on the French side about exactly what you want from NATO. So what are your thoughts on the 20th anniversary?
Thanks a lot, Edward. If anyone has some specific questions about what Macron's thinking, please feel free to reach out by chat or directly by email. I can give you my concerned point of view from that. But listen, I think what is interesting to note is that 20 years onwards and 70 years onwards with the alliance, the perception that we have that the alliance is enlarging, for instance, or expanding, quote unquote, I think couldn't be more right, but also couldn't be more wrong. Could it be more wrong? Because the alliance is not enlarging or expanding. It is countries that are actually willingly and legally joining the alliance, right? So we should not say, and I think it's important to remind as well for the general public in terms of the writing, that we shouldn't even say NATO is enlarging or there was an expansion of NATO. It is, in recent months, Sweden and Finland joining willingly the alliance, which means that NATO's borders are not really expanding. It's basically countries feeling insecure that are fulfilling that mission of collective security, fulfilling that mission of better deterrence, better dialogue, and better cooperation. So I think it's really important in terms of the optics, because the opposite of these optics that NATO is expanding is basically Russian propaganda, right? The fait accompli that the Kremlin has been feeding us in terms of information warfare and information propaganda, that the alliance is getting closer to us, quote unquote, that the alliance is out there to get us, quote unquote, that it's going to place defensive or offensive missile systems that could hold Russia at risk of interdiction or destruction. So I think the opposite is equally dangerous when it comes to feeding that sort of propaganda machine around the expansion of NATO. So that would be the first thing. And then from being brain dead to being back on track, I think this is also one of the key findings of that report that we had recently on the future of European security and NATO, is that even if it's brain dead, it's still pretty muscular, right? That's regardless, I think the brain dead comment was probably one of the most misinterpreted quote ever, and I don't think it was leading to anything else but just scaremongering. But in any case, the alliance is back, and it's still fulfilling its mission of collective defense and ensuring the security of its members. And I think it took 2 invasions of Ukraine to realize that. And we have the track record of policy and change and reform to show that since 2014-15 and the initial response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, things now are up to speed. We have 2 new allies. We have a collective security that is probably more ensured than ever, regardless of potential statements by some US politicians seeking re-election or something in the United States. The alliance is still there. It's still standing. And I think it is now understanding again what its core purpose and its mission is.
Thanks so much for that. And now, finally, Dalia, I still remember the absolutely transformative feeling in Lithuania when first of all, with the Prague summit, making the decision, and then when NATO actually happened. And it's a kind of paradox that Lithuania has never in its history been more secure, even though the security environment probably hasn't seemed more daunting since 1939. So do you remember what you were doing on this day 20 years ago?
Thank you. Hi, Edward, and thank you for having me here. Yes, it was 20 years ago, and recently we've been exchanging with my colleagues, actually, remembering that day, March 29th, very close. And Baltic states joining NATO 20 years ago and being accepted to NATO 20 years ago confirms that NATO's strategic judgment was absolutely correct, taking the perspective. It was of a critical importance if we take into account the current situation. And it offered to the Baltic states, it offered stability and security to our societies. Actually, it offered us freedom to create the life we want, to create our states. And Edward, you know that the strive for freedom is part of Baltic identity and strive for just things. However, when we look back, the road to the membership, to joining NATO, was not an easy one. And for Lithuania, it was quite quite challenging in the sense that Lithuania, first of all, wrote a letter asking to be accepted to NATO and not waiting for the invitation. And it was the context that, first of all, the NATO allies had to get used to the idea of accepting other new members. One thing. Another thing, it was the time of concerns about establishing relationship with Russia, not provoking them, appeasement relationship. What else? Then the issue of Baltics being defendability of Baltics, capability of Baltic self-defense as well as defendability. That's already responsibility of NATO. Russia offering its security guarantees and also initiating negotiations with the Baltic states. So all that package, as well as the idea of keeping neutrality on the eastern flank, from today's perspective, it is just sounds quite unrealistic or worrisome. On the other hand, even then, to be very fair, Baltics understood that they are not going, or we are not going to be security consumers. But we have to think of how to to contribute to. So I think we were one of the first, even prior to joining NATO as full-fledged members. We started participating in peacekeeping missions, Afghanistan, Mali, and so many other, 120 or 50 I counted. And today, Baltics, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia are the key contributing to defense, well above 2%. Actually, we talk about almost 3% of our GDP for defense. So perhaps I will stop here.
Super. Well, thanks so much for setting the scene to our four panelists, and it's now over to our very distinguished guests from a large number of media outlets. I see dozens and dozens here. So if you want to raise your hand, you can do that with by electronic means, or you can pose a question in the chat, and I will happily read it out for you. And we're going to carry on for roughly the next 40 minutes, and so we'll try and get through as many questions as we can. I suppose the thing that leaps out for me from this is that the Baltic states, and to an extent also Romania and Bulgaria, but chiefly the Baltic states, were really brought in as kind of NATO light at the beginning. There was no enhanced forward presence. There was the absolute minimum of air policing, and there were no contingency plans. The contingency plans came in only after the Strasbourg Kale summit. So there were several years where your deterrence consisted of having a laminated copy of Article 5 nailed to the frontier post with Russia, and everyone relied on that. And of course, it's been a huge change since then. We've actually started building defence, and we are increasingly worried that we haven't done enough, and we have a lot more to do. So please do jump in. I'm scanning between my screens at the moment, and I see we've got everyone from we've got Radio Canada, which I used to string for. We've got the New York Times. We have media from all over the world. So and I know journalists don't like being shy. So please, yes, Christina Maza, I think I saw did your hand go up briefly, Christina? No, it's gone down again. Jen Kirby, Jen, turn your screen on so we can see you and ask a question.
Sure. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I guess I hope this isn't sort of going far afield, but I'm kind of curious what the panelists think of these Eastern Baltic states and their role in potentially ushering Ukraine into NATO or creating some sort of security arrangement. Obviously, we know Washington and Berlin are very reluctant, but these Baltics, the Eastern European states, have been kind of a champion for Ukraine. And I'm kind of curious if you could offer some perspective on how they're thinking about it. Thanks.
Good. Dalia, I think that's one for you. How do Lithuanians regard the prospect of Ukrainian membership? And I might come to Lance next, just to see how it might look from the military committee's point of view. They used to work. Dalia.
Thank you. A very short answer. Baltics, Lithuania are full support of membership, Ukrainian membership in NATO, and it was to some extent disappointing that Vilnius summit was productive in defense, in delivering defense capabilities or defense plans, regional plans, but it was not run short of really defining the future for Ukraine's possibility of joining NATO. So definitely the aim is for Washington that being united in NATO to offer Ukraine membership perspective. We absolutely know that invitation does not mean the membership immediately tomorrow, but a clear map, very concrete, and less vague phrases like "as long as it takes," but really giving a proper timeline. That's the Baltic stand, and okay, I can't say entirely on the Central and Eastern Europe, but that's we are in that group.
And Lance, how does it look from your from your point of view? Any thoughts on and then we'll come to Lara Jakes next from the New York Times. But Lance, a minute of your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. I think, well, let me just start. My sense is that the Baltic states have been very supportive of Ukraine membership, right? I think they see a lot of themselves in this quest for membership from Ukraine and the process that they've been going through and the trials and tribulations. A little bit on the military aspect, let me just share with you that Ukraine was under the process of being a partner, enhanced opportunity partner, et cetera. So we've seen all of that. And one aspect of that was the transformation of their military forces, particularly interoperability of the military forces, NATO standards adaptation by the military forces. And I can tell you that I saw firsthand before the invasion that Ukraine took this very seriously, and made great advancements in very tangible and demonstrable ways before the Russian invasion. Most impressively is I saw the Ukraine military forces and their leadership continue this transformation and this work towards NATO standards and interoperability to satisfy the NATO requirements even after the invasion. And so that was really striking, the way we had personal interactions with their leadership with very tangible transformation efforts and doctrine changes and training changes and interoperability changes that really matched with what NATO was doing. And then the final thought on this is, let's remember, before the invasion, I think most people would think that NATO was helping Ukraine. It was sort of a one-way street, right? It was NATO help, NATO expertise, NATO training, Western nations training, et cetera. Now I have to tell you, it's a two-way street. We have a lot to learn from the Western nations. We have a lot to learn from the NATO organization, from what Ukraine has done during this conflict in things like command and control of disaggregated forces, logistics and sustainment of disaggregated forces, the innovation and creativity that they put forth on the battlefield, particularly related to technology. So I think that there's a lot of benefit that their forces have gained from this and that we could gain from them. And we'll see how the politics play out.
Great. Let's. We've got a good question coming in from Maurizio, but first of all, I'm going to go to Lara Jakes, the New York Times. Lara, far away.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to follow up on Jen's very good question and the observations that both of you just made. As you know, there's a movement in Washington and some quarters of the Biden administration to let Ukraine begin accession talks to NATO in the same way that it's beginning accession talks to the EU. As I'm sure you're aware, this is getting pushback of the higher level of the policymakers. So I'm wondering what can be done from outside of Washington between now and the NATO summit in July to perhaps change this dynamic, as I'm sure the panelists here would want to do. And what does it say about NATO if they do not even begin the beginning of accession talks, given that the EU is already doing that?
Thanks very much, Lara. So accession talks and the dance around them. I think let's go to Ambassador Jones and then Mathieu on that. So Paul, you go first.
Yeah, thanks. I think essential to getting in what I think many of us agree would be the right direction is to make clear what I think I would certainly say Poles believe and many of us believe is that Ukraine would be a great added advantage for the alliance in terms of defense and security. You know, between Ukraine, you know, as Lance was indicating, has developed tremendous capability and tremendous interoperability. I would stretch that back to when Russia, you know, originally invaded Ukraine back in 2014. So it's been 10 years now. And we and NATO allies such as the United States, Poland, and the UK in particular worked with Ukraine during that period. And then obviously it's ramped up tremendously since then. I think, you know, the debate, the discussion should be, you know, how Ukraine adds to the alliance in terms of defense capability, as well as in terms of values and the completion sort of another step toward the completion of Europe as a whole and free continent. Poland obviously is very strongly in favor. I would just take us back to 2013. The entire eastern flank was nervous of Russia at that time. Later invaded Ukraine in 2014. We saw in 2022. When I got to Poland in 2015, I was looking over previous communications, and the Poles had quite emphatically warned the U.S. administration in 2010 of Russians' intentions in Ukraine, particularly, but along the eastern flank. So I think bringing Ukraine in as a strength, making the alliance stronger, is our best argument.
Great. And Mattia, thoughts from you, and if you want to give us an insight into the evolving French thinking about NATO, we'd be very grateful.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'll give it a try. But yeah, sure. So to sort of piggyback on what Ambassador Joel said, and I fully agree with his remarks. So you have two ways of seeing it, right? The first way, when it comes to NATO trying to incorporate more members, is the deterrence part, right? It's the Russia policy. The fact that, yes, if we do announce that Ukraine will at some point join the alliance very overtly and start making the first steps, it will lead to escalatory patterns. However, that's the opposite side, is self-deterrence. NATO policy cannot be solely defined and ruled by what the Kremlin doesn't think. We have much wider policy around it, and we should not be self-deterred entirely just because there are proclamations and saber-rattling, specifically nuclear saber-rattling. This will be a very defining moment for the alliance if we get there, in terms of fine-tuning communication, fine-tuning the message, and make sure that when we say A, we mean A, and it's understood as A and not distorted as B by the Kremlin, which will be a very strong and tough endeavor. But we have to try, right? Look at the debate around weapons procurement for Ukraine. About 2 years ago, we were still debating whether F-16s or HIMARS would be a bit too much in terms of how we would antagonize the Kremlin if we were coming to aid Ukraine. And now we have F-16s and HIMARS in Ukraine, trained by NATO advisors and troops from NATO countries. So we have increasingly increased the temperature, basically the lobster in the tank analogy. We have made sure that the lobster is being boiled to perfection, and we haven't thrown the lobster directly into hot water. Same for the troops, right? And going into French thinking, for instance, we could have been a bit smarter in our approach to signaling the intention to send NATO troops, right? Boots on the ground can mean anything from cooks to medics to engineers, not necessarily war fighters immediately. We could have been a bit more coherent in our approach, I would say, when it comes to communicating what troops really mean. Same for Ukraine joining the alliance. We need to be a bit more decisive and be smart in our communication approach to make sure that we do integrate Ukraine in the future of European security, because Ukraine's fate depends on it, and our own fate in terms of European security also depends on Ukraine. So it's a very complicated balance. We have to try. If we don't try, we'll fail automatically, right? 100% of those who participated have won. So I'll stop there.
Super. We've now got a question from Maurizio, who is the Maurizio Ghieri, the GMU postdoc EU fellow. And his question is about this DIME, diplomacy, information / cyber, military and economy toolbox. And his question is about what NATO should do in order to win the hybrid war that's going on against Putin. He says, what should we do quickly to win the hybrid war with Putin before he invades other regions in neighboring nation states, continuing the pattern since 2008. So that's a really interesting question, because NATO is not really geared up for hybrid. It does defensive hybrid, but it's most of the tools in the hybrid arsenal are in the hands of governments rather than NATO planners. So I'm going to throw this nice, easy question to you, Lance. How can NATO do offensive hybrid? And if so, how should it do it? And how should it do it quickly?
Yeah, thank you for passing that over to me, Edward. And listen, I'll agree with you as far as NATO being a bit disaggregated on this. And despite being sort of the military member with military background on the panel, I have to answer this question starting with the political aspect of it, right? Because here's my sense of this, right? There needs to be the highest levels of political agreement, consensus, and buy-in associated with this aspect that leads to clear policy and a strategy associated with being able to resist the malign influence, the hybrid influence, this gray zone activities with respect to Russia in this case. And I think, when you look at that holistically, you're going to see the opportunities for offensive type capability. You're going to see the opportunity for defensive capability, which should include things like civil resilience, government resilience, infrastructure resilience, society resilience, and an information part of this. And I think that there has to be some reckoning associated with the level of risk that the governments, the member state governments, are willing to accept as they give consensus for a NATO policy associated with this. And right now, I just don't see that coming together in a way that is unified and with solidarity from the NATO alliance. Like we said, it's aggregated. I think all of that is not a very good answer to the quickly part of the question. But I think it is one that is very, very necessary in order to put together a deterrent effect, which has a very clear political will and political credibility combined with a level of capacity and capability such that the adversary sees that the costs are much greater than the benefit on that. So I know that's a high level kind of vague answer, but this is an incredibly difficult one to put together in a very coherent way for the alliance.
Super. I'm going to come to Dalia next, because Dalia, you've literally written the book on hybrid from a Lithuanian point of view. I can't think of anyone better to answer that. Then I'm going to get to Mattia. Then we've got a good question about Poland from Vanessa from the AP, and I'll give that one to Paul. But Dalia, give us your thoughts on hybrid first of all.
I'm really following up on the thoughts already said, and immediately listening to the question, I thought comprehensive defense or total defense concept that actually first starts from the national level. And this is whole of society approach that should be really built up. So in addition to traditional defense, these competences, this comprehensive defense approach should be implemented as much as possible. And here if whole of government approach, because that's traditional, that's military approach, is quite understandable among member states, NATO member states. So whole of society approach, bottom up, cooperating with the civil government, is much less cultivated. Differently, what we do in the Baltic Sea region, it's 3 Baltic states, together with the Nordic countries, really work on that comprehensive defense concept that is not only in theory, but it's the interoperability is implemented in reality. So I can really enlarge more, but I can also say that recently we're about to finish the resilience curriculum for military academies for learners to set a certain framework for encouraging comprehensive defense for member states and putting them on the same stage. And I want just to step in mentioning when we talk about arguments for Ukraine being a reliable NATO partner and joining at some point NATO, that nobody doubts about military traditional defense capacities and capabilities of the country, but it's also they're extremely strong in a whole of society approach. So this is also a learning factor as well as contributor to the overall the transatlantic defense capabilities.
Right, thanks. Of course, it's interesting. I mean, when we talk about hybrid, our focus naturally shifts to defense and resilience, and there's a huge amount we can learn from the Nordic and Baltic countries on that. But of course, Mauritius's question was actually about whether we can do offensive hybrid. Mattia, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do actually, and I want to take a more counterintuitive and a bit more assertive approach, bottom line is a hybrid doesn't exist, okay? At least in Kremlin's terms. Hybrid is great for horticulture. It's great for genetics because it breeds a mix of ambiguous methods, whether it's short of war, sub-threshold, you name it, below Article 5. The Kremlin is not ambiguous in its approach. They are at war with us, okay? It's an extremely aggressive statement. It's a statement that nobody in Western capitals wants to hear, and I recognize that. But it's something that is slowly shifting the way we do approach the current Kremlin leadership, and we do approach deterrence against said leadership. Not least because they define themselves in a full-scale conflict against NATO and Western interests. It's not a war with tanks, it's not a war with weapons, the way we usually define them as Article 5, but is still very much a low-intensity conflict. It's a form of war short of bang, if you will. So they're not ambiguous at all. When they use cyber attacks, electromagnetic disruption, or information warfare capabilities, it isn't very much war. It's just that we haven't defined a threshold as it being necessarily considered or understood as open conflict or confrontation with said Russian leadership. So I think the wind, at least in the sort of Russia watching community, is going towards that understanding that it is very much a low intensity conflict, and that hybrid is in a way something of the past. It doesn't change the tools, and Lenz mentioned it about gray zone operations, for instance, what we call sub-threshold provocations and so on, that are equally defined as a means of warfare against us. And whatever comes next in the Kremlin, whether it's bionic Putin or post-Putin, will still remain as such. So that changes our approach to deterrence, that changes our approach to how we do anticipate the more offensive or aggressive or bolder actions against the Kremlin. And I think the past 2 years with Ukraine have shown us that we can be bolder, right? And there's a whole different discussion. I'm sure we could have an hour and a half discussions about red lines, about what deterrence in the gray zone looks like, what sub-threshold deterrence and bolder selective actions in the gray zone look like for us to increase the temperature of said lobster tank once again. So just, I don't want to go into that debate because it's way too long, but please make sure that the framing of that understanding is, going where the wind is going, and the wind is no longer about, it's just being hybrid, we're not too sure, it's war, okay? And this is something that is highly unpalatable for policymakers, but that we have to unfortunately accept because the competitor that we're facing has already accepted it and is no longer ambiguous about all these means.
Well, thanks. I think we could all make a good resolution never to talk about hybrid ever again. I never liked it. I always thought the old Soviet term active measures was perfectly adequate for that. Now we've got a great question now from a very topical one from Vanessa Giera, who is the AP correspondent in Warsaw, Poland. And she says, what about the repeated Russian incursions into the airspace of Poland, NATO country? The latest is the 39 seconds when a missile went over Polish airspace, but this is by far not the first. So let me come to you, Paul. If you were still sitting in your ambassador's office, what telegram would you be drafting to Washington, and what recommendation would you be giving in response to what is actually quite a serious breach of NATO's territorial integrity?
Yeah, thanks, Edward, and thanks, Vanessa. Good to speak with you again. First off, I'm sorry. I had a little interruption there, but I'm back. First, I'd say, I obviously don't know. I have no insight from the United States side nor the Polish side on specifically how they're assessing this and other incursions. I'd say a couple of things. One is, for context, during my time, and I'm sure it persists, the Poles are constantly tested by Russian Air Force in the north, by active measures of various kinds, and they take all of those tests extremely seriously. They usually don't publicize them when they're not made public for other reasons. In the lead up in my time there, And they, consider every incursion in any way as a way to test, to probe, to assess defenses, and to assess response times, and a number of other things. I would say one of the, I think, great successes of NATO's and Poland's response to the more recent invasion of Ukraine in 2022 is to provide the level of security that has made what could have been a weak link of the supply routes through Poland into Ukraine not at all a weak link. I mean, I think we've seen the Russians be very cautious and avoid, in most respects, any incursions or actions against that supply line, because they know how Poland and the alliance in the United States would react to that. I would say on these specific incursions, in the sense, is it intentional or not? In the end, it doesn't necessarily matter, because it is, I'm sure, being taken with the utmost seriousness, and I'm sure responses are being taken in order to further deter or respond to such actions in the future.
Vanessa, do you want to come back on that with a follow-up, either to Paul or to one of the other panelists?
I mean, I think that was a really great response.
Lance wants to jump in a
It
moment.
definitely does raise the level of anxieties in Polish society. So I guess, yeah, I guess I would be curious. And also I've been thinking about this issue of the anxieties that people are experiencing now in this region, and how much of them are reasonable, and how much are actually part of Russia's sort of, we don't want to call it hybrid warfare, but, war against the West to make people feel afraid. There are stories in the press here about people trying to buy second homes in Spain, or even moving to Spain just to get away. People are buying gold, and it's actually pushed, gold up to an all-time high. And it's not without cost, because people are making really expensive financial decisions based on their fears.
Yeah, well, I think this is a really important point. This is whether it was a mistake or not, it's slowly salami slicing our deterrent. We've seen in your neighboring country, the Czech Republic, the Verbatice arms dumps being blown up. We've seen assassinations, one in Germany a couple of years ago, one in Britain years before that. But again and again, we're seeing different sorts of pinprick attacks, and we never seem to have anything to do in response except issue cross press releases and say we're gravely concerned. Lance, what should we be doing?
Yeah, thanks. I think this is a really interesting and very well put questions, and the comments associated with it, because I think this is a very specific example of how this cross cuts against a lot of the sort of themes and concepts that we're talking about, like policy associated with resisting Russian malign influence, the hybrid aspect that Matthew said, that is just really just there mixed with traditional. It's not something that's parsed out separate. Dalia, total defense, civil resilience, etc. I would repeat what the ambassador said. The nations and the NATO alliance take this very seriously, and they do a very detailed scrub of the intelligence associated with it, both the technical aspects of the intelligence and also the human mental aspect of the intelligence, which is really hard to determine the intent, right? So these things could be just accidents. We've seen evidence of that. These things maybe are some evidence of probing and a way to test and a way to desensitize a little bit, sort of this mix of this hybrid along with traditional conventional warfare that Matthew talked about. But I think the other thing that we need to really think about if we are going to react to this is let's look back what Turkey did in Syria some years ago against the Russian aircraft that kept flying over the sliver of the Turkish airspace for just a few seconds, right? Now, admittedly, that was a manned aircraft. It wasn't a ballistic missile, so maybe there's a different threshold there. But I think we also need to think about the consequences before we overreact to something like that. And so the consequences being things like, okay, so we shoot down a ballistic missile and a bunch of debris lands on a Polish village and people are killed. Are we ready to do that? And when otherwise that missile was just going to fly over Polish airspace and land outside of Poland. Did we make things actually worse? There's also a technical aspect to this that we would have to own up to with the political policy, right? In capacity and capability, and again, on consequences of either shooting it down or it's not perfect. It's not like if we put our capabilities in a certain area, we can shoot missiles down with 100% accuracy. So we have to be ready of, well, we shot at it and we missed. So there's a lot of aspect to go with this. And then the final thought is this all goes to, I think, an overall policy about how we are reacting to Russia's malign influence that has to include a very robust information campaign for our citizens related to the civil resilience associated with these activities.
Yeah. And I think this is absolutely vital. This war on nerves is, as Matthias just pointed out in the chat, it's the psychological preparation of the battlefield. And if you project the conviction that Russia is invincible, that NATO doesn't work, that you could be hit in, your country's deterrence is shot to pieces, then you've, as Russia, or for that matter, as the People's Republic of China, you're already halfway to winning because people, the defeatist mentality is kind of ingrained. We've got time for just one more question, and that's from Josh Luckenborg from the National Defense Magazine. I think I got that right, Josh. And he's pointing out that all the money that's going into defense is going into stuff. And he says, Poland is investing heavily in defense, are the Baltic states and the other so-called new member, but Central East European members planning to do the same? And if so, what defense technologies are they investing in? Which is really interesting. Dalia, is Lithuania developing anything? I know the Estonians are getting into drones and battlefield robots, but is there any homegrown defense technology in Lithuania we should be keeping an eye at?
I think exactly that. I say even not like Estonia, Lithuania, or Latvia, but it's really Baltic, although at national level. So it's defense plans, and these are this, as I call it, smart balance, where we're planning what is needed to have this sufficient defense or self-defense, at least the first days, in case of really attack happens. So drones or air defense, not only drones are there, as well as a lot of dual technique applications, and of course being very close with Ukraine, cooperating. So a lot of things are, if I may say so, tested technologically and improved while working in the field. Preparing the infrastructure to host the German brigade 2027, platforms for acquisition of tanks and other ammunition, which I simply not really so good in explaining, quoting, but I'm happy to provide more information. So these are the things that are in the plans, and really looking into the compatibility to build a persuasive defense capabilities within the Baltic region, including Poland, because the focus is of ability of self-defense, while in the meantime the NATO allies come in assistance.
Great. I think we've just got time for one quick question, and I see a hand up from Syed Rizwan Ali. So would you like to introduce yourself and ask a quick question? We'll have a quick answer, and then I'm going to hand back to my CEPA colleagues for a wrap up.
Yeah, thank you very much, Edward. I'm grateful to you that you have given me opportunity to join this. In my view, NATO's presence is like a guarantee for world and region's security and stability. But my question is that nexus of Moscow and Beijing has already endangered the peace of world. So, what my question is, what NATO's intentions are to make peace and trade links to Western world? And my last and very important question is, world is heading towards World War III. So how to make sure that this war don't spread war and world faces of peace? Thank you.
So I think your question is about what NATO can do to prevent World War III, which is obviously a huge subject.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I think this is possibly above the pay grade even of our elevated panel, but I think I'll go to you, Ambassador Jones, because there is a perception, particularly in the outside the Euro-Atlantic sphere, that NATO is basically a projection of US imperial interests, and that the European allies are basically singing along to the American tune for their own reasons, but that the rest of the world should see NATO with a degree of suspicion as an instrument of projection of American power. And NATO probably could do a better job in rebutting those preconceptions. So if you were speaking to an audience in this what we sometimes loosely call the global South, what would you say to counter those criticisms of NATO?
Yeah, thanks so much, and thanks for the question. I would say, and I completely agree, and I think I don't know, I mean, perhaps imperialism, but I think there's also a sense in much of the rest of the world that, you know, this is a European issue. This isn't really an issue of global importance, what's happening, because NATO and Russia have been, you know, tense for quite some time. I would say, first and foremost, you know, look at the facts as Mathieu said earlier. Countries want to join NATO. They want to join NATO because they're feeling their security is under some threat. And, you know, they had already, in some cases, Finland, Sweden had already been part of the EU, so it wasn't an economic issue. It was that their security felt under threat. NATO has never, you know, encroached into, you know, outside of its territory. It's a defensive alliance. It has helped partners who have sought its help. So I think, you know, regional arrangements, wherever they are, that can pool the resources for defensive security, you know, are unfortunately needed in the world today, and that is why, you know, there's been this voluntary number of countries that have come together, and a couple more want to come to join because they want to feel secure. I think it adds to the security of the world because it removes an entire major theater of traditional warfare from a World War III battlefield, right? If there's going to be conflict in the world, it's not going to happen within NATO, and it's not going to happen. It is less likely to happen on NATO's periphery when NATO is strong and is able to deter adversaries. So therefore, we see the more likelihood of sort of global conflict emanating in other parts of the world.
It's, I think, really well worth remembering that when Europe likes to say Europe's at peace, critics would say Europe's just between genocides, and Europe's ability to turn its own quarrels into wars that are not only enormously costly in human life and destruction in Europe, but then spill out into the rest of the world, is something that we all need to bear in mind. I wonder if any of the other panelists wants to jump in for 30 seconds at the end before I wrap up. Just stick your hand up or unmute yourself if you do. Dalia, give us 30 seconds from Lithuania. We've just had terrible news of glide bombs landing on Kharkiv, which is a big reminder of how precious our peace and safety is. But
I think if we do not sort out, we have the war. We have the war in Europe. It's not the war only in Ukraine. So I think we risk now without solving, but more like prolonging this confrontation with NATO and NATO and the West. So Europe might fall into a permanent cycle of wars and frozen conflicts. And it is not good neither for Europe, nor for the world, nor for the United States. And worst of all, it is not good for people because every life is matter. And the right to be free and to decide your own life, it's the key thing. So that's where I think NATO is really strong. It's about freedom. It's about values.
Thanks. Well, I think that's probably it. I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of thoughts. One is that I feel that NATO was a tremendously good answer to the questions of the past. It did brilliantly well during the Cold War, and it then caught its breath and was instrumental, I think, in sorting out the security architecture of the continent in the post-war years, and avoided a lot of things that could have gone wrong. My worry now is whether NATO is fit for the future. And I think if we're having this discussion in 10 years' time, we'll be asking very difficult questions about whether NATO was really able to deal with rising threats from outside its area of operation, particularly this huge question about how we deal with China's desire to be the world's most powerful country by 2049. There's also, I think, quite a big question about Africa, where we see Russia going into places in sub-Saharan Africa, which has traditionally been heavily influenced by France, and the inability to push back there, and with all the enormously negative consequences, both for people living there and also if they migrate, for the migration picture in Europe. And then I think the third big question of whether it's really sustainable for the United States to do so much of the heavy lifting. The European, the non-American partners combined are bigger and richer than the United States, and they are still, despite the fantastic efforts made by countries like Lithuania spending 3% of GDP, they are still freeloaders. And is the United States really willing to carry on bearing that burden in exchange for benefits that are sometimes tangible, sometimes more intangible? So I think we have a lot more to discuss in the years ahead. But in the meantime, I want to thank my 4 distinguished panelists very much. Look forward to seeing them atom to atom rather than electron to electron soon. And thank you very much for the galaxy of journalistic talent who've tuned in. We hope this was welcome. And if you have any follow-up questions, you're welcome to contact CEPA directly, or track me down on Twitter or LinkedIn, and I'd be very happy to respond to any questions that you've got. It's press@cepa.org will reach our hotshot team. So that's it for me. Thank you all very much.